Her father sold his virgin bride daughter to Mountain Man as punishment, but what he did shocking. Amina had always known that life in her small mountain village was never easy, but she had never imagined that it could be so cruel. She grew up surrounded by towering peaks, dense forests, and narrow winding paths that seemed to stretch endlessly. The village itself was quiet, with only the sound of children playing, goats bleating, and the occasional gossip of villagers drifting through the air. Life was simple, and for most families, it revolved around survival and tradition. Amina's family was no different, though her father had a temper and a strict way of enforcing his rules that sometimes made life feel more like a test than a home. Her father, Karim, was a man who believed deeply in honor and respect, but his understanding of these concepts was rigid, unyielding, and often harsh. He ran the household with an iron fist. Every decision, from who could visit their home to how meals were prepared, was dictated by him. Amina, though only 16, had learned to be cautious around him, careful not to say the wrong word or make even a small mistake. Despite her fear, she had always loved him in her own way, hoping that one day his sternness would soften, revealing the warmth she sometimes glimpsed behind his sharp eyes. But that hope was shattered one fateful morning. A dispute had erupted in the village, though the details were quickly forgotten. What mattered was that Karim believed the dispute had somehow brought shame to their family. In his mind, honor had been damaged, and he alone had the authority to restore it. The method he chose shocked everyone, including Amina. Karim called Amina into the main room of their modest home, the same room where she had spent countless afternoons helping her mother weave and cook. The walls were bare, except for a few faded pictures of ancestors whose faces seemed stern and unapproving. Amina's heart pounded as she stepped inside, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Her father's voice was low but cold, leaving no room for argument. "Amina," he began, "you must leave this home and marry the Mountain Man." The words hit her like a stone, her mind froze. "Marry who?" she whispered, barely able to comprehend what he had said. Karim's eyes did not waver. "You know him, the man who lives alone in the mountains. He will take you as his wife. It is the only way to restore our family's honor." Amina shook her head, disbelief clouding her vision. She could not understand how her father, the man who had taught her to read, to care for others, and to dream of a life beyond the mountains, could send her away like this. "Father, please, there must be another way," she pleaded, her voice trembling. But Karim did not soften. His face, lined with years of hardship and pride, showed no sign of compassion. To him, this was not cruelty, it was justice. Amina was being punished, yes, but in his mind, it was a necessary act to protect the family from disgrace. The villagers might whisper and gossip, but at least Karim believed that the truth of their honor would remain intact. The preparations began almost immediately. Amina's mother, though gentle and kind, had no power to stop her husband. She tried to comfort Amina, offering her shawls and warm words, but even she seemed resigned to the father's decision. The villagers watched from afar, some shaking their heads in sympathy, others muttering about the harshness of Karim's judgment. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did, and soon the entire village knew of the arrangement. Amina felt the weight of their stares as she walked through the narrow streets, clutching her small bundle of belongings. She felt exposed, like a bird being carried away from its nest, and fear and anger battled inside her heart. As the day of departure drew near, Amina tried to find comfort in small things. She wandered through the forests near her home, touching the bark of old trees, listening to the streams, and remembering the moments of joy she had shared with friends and family. She remembered playing near the river with her younger brother, laughing as they skipped stones across the water. She remembered helping her mother bake bread and learning to sew patterns into cloth. Each memory felt like a lifeline, a reminder of the world she was being forced to leave behind. Yet even in these moments of reflection, fear gnawed at her. The mountain man was a stranger, a figure shrouded in mystery and whispered warnings. The villagers described him as rough, wild, and unpredictable. Some said he had lived alone for years, surviving only on what he could hunt or gather from the forest. Others said he was cold, untrusting of anyone who approached him. Amina did not know what to believe, but the thought of leaving everything familiar for such uncertainty filled her with dread. On the morning of her departure, the village seemed eerily quiet. Birds chirped softly, the wind rustled through the trees, but there was no laughter, no chatter. Amina stood at the edge of her home, looking back at the place she had known all her life. Her mother's eyes were red from crying, and her younger brother clung to her dress, unable to understand why she had to go. The neighbors nodded silently, offering small tokens of sympathy, but no one dared to speak against her father's decision. Karim's expression remained unreadable as he led her to the path that would take her to the mountain man's home. He spoke little, his silence heavier than any words could be. Amina felt a mixture of fear, anger, and sadness. She wanted to shout, to run, to demand that he see the injustice of his actions, but her legs felt heavy and her voice caught in her throat. The path ahead was long and steep, winding through forests and over rocky hills. Every step seemed to take her further from the life she had known and closer to a future she could not imagine. As she walked, Amina tried to steel herself. She remembered the lessons her mother had taught her about resilience and courage. She reminded herself that even in fear, there could be strength. She could not change what her father had decided, but she could control how she faced the journey ahead. Each step became a small act of defiance, a reminder that she was not powerless, even if the world seemed determined to tell her otherwise. By the time night fell, Amina had reached the edge of the dense forest that marked the beginning of the mountain man's territory. The moon cast silver light on the trees, creating shadows that danced like ghostly figures. She paused, taking a deep breath, and whispered a silent promise to herself. She would survive. She would endure. And somehow, she would find a way to live with the choices that had been made for her. Though the fear remained, a small spark of determination had ignited within her. Amina knew that her life had changed forever, but she also knew that her story was far from over. The mountains ahead were daunting, the journey uncertain, but she would meet it with courage, patience, and a hope that perhaps, even in the harshest circumstances, life could still offer unexpected kindness and surprising strength. Amina's journey into the mountains was more difficult than she had imagined. The path was narrow, rocky, and steep, and the air grew colder as she climbed higher. Her small bundle of belongings bounced against her back with every careful step, and she had to cling to branches and rocks to keep from slipping. Each step felt like a test of her courage and strength, and she realized that the physical challenge of the mountains mirrored the emotional challenge she faced. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, the people who loved her, and the sense of safety that, until recently, had always surrounded her. By the time she reached the small, hidden cabin where the mountain man lived, dusk had settled over the peaks. The sky was painted in shades of pink and purple, and a cold wind swept through the trees. The cabin looked rough from the outside, made of weathered wood with a slanted roof and a small chimney that puffed out a thin line of smoke. It seemed lonely and unwelcoming, and for a moment, Amina felt the fear that had been simmering inside her all day rise again. She hesitated at the door, unsure of what awaited her inside. The mountain man, whose name was Harun, opened the door before she could knock. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the gathering darkness. At first, his expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile. He did not smile, but he also did not speak harshly. He simply stood there, waiting for Amina to enter. The silence between them was heavy, and Amina felt as though she were walking into a world entirely different from the one she had left behind. "You can stay here," Harun said finally, his voice low and steady. It was not unkind, but it carried authority. Make yourself at home. Amina nodded, barely able to speak, and stepped inside. The cabin was small, with a single room that served as both living area and kitchen. A fireplace in the corner held the remains of a dying fire, and a few simple pieces of furniture were scattered around. Despite its simplicity, the cabin had a certain warmth. The wooden walls and floor carried the scent of pine and smoke, and the soft glow of the fire created shadows that danced along the walls. It was nothing like the comfortable home she had left behind, but it was a place to rest, and for that, Amina felt a flicker of relief. The first few days were the hardest. Amina struggled to adjust to the silence and isolation of the mountains. There were no neighbors to greet, no market to visit, no familiar voices to comfort her. Every sound, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant cry of an owl, the creaking of the cabin, seemed amplified, reminding her constantly that she was alone. At night she lay awake on the small bed, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls, and thought of her mother, her brother, and the life she had left behind. The loneliness was almost unbearable, but Amina knew she had to endure it. Harun, for his part, maintained a careful distance. He did not force Amina to do anything she did not want to do, nor did he interfere unnecessarily in her life. At first, his silence and distance frightened her. She had expected cruelty or harshness, but instead she found a quiet, almost solemn presence. He would tend to the small garden outside, chop wood for the fire, or repair the cabin, all without saying much. Occasionally he would speak in short, simple sentences, giving instructions or asking questions, but he never raised his voice. Slowly, Amina began to understand that Harun's life had been shaped by solitude, by the demands of surviving in a harsh environment, and by experiences that had left him wary of others. Despite the fear and uncertainty, small moments of kindness began to emerge. One evening, after a particularly long day of walking in the mountains, Amina found a small bowl of soup waiting for her. The steam rose gently, carrying the scent of herbs and roasted vegetables. Harun had prepared it not as a favor but as a simple act of practicality. She needed nourishment to recover from the journey. Still, Amina felt a warmth in that gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence and her humanity. Over time, she also learned to help with the daily tasks. She gathered water from the nearby stream, tended the small garden, and assisted in cooking. Each task, though difficult, gave her a sense of purpose and gradually helped her feel less like a prisoner and more like a part of the cabin's life. Harun did not praise her or express gratitude in words, but the occasional nod or quiet glance conveyed acknowledgement and respect. Amina began to see that, while the mountain was harsh and unforgiving, it also offered a strange kind of safety, a world where one's actions mattered, and where the simplicity of life demanded presence and effort. One day, as Amina was gathering firewood, she stumbled and fell near the edge of a small cliff. The sharp rocks threatened to injure her badly, but Harun's quick hands caught her just in time. His grip was strong and steady, and the look in his eyes was a mix of concern and something she could not yet understand. She realized then that, despite his rough exterior, he cared about her safety. That single moment shifted something inside her. The fear that had dominated her thoughts began to mix with a cautious trust. She started to see Harun not as a terrifying figure, but as a man who had learned to survive in solitude and who was capable of kindness. Amina also began to notice the beauty of the mountains, the way sunlight reflected off the peaks in the morning, how the wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and how the streams sang as they flowed over rocks. She discovered small wildflowers growing in hidden corners, birds with bright feathers, and deer that watched quietly from a distance. These glimpses of beauty gave her moments of peace and reminded her that the world, even when harsh, still held wonder. Slowly, she began to walk the mountain paths with more confidence, learning to navigate the terrain and even enjoying the quiet rhythm of her new life. Despite these small comforts, Amina's heart still ached for her old life. She missed her mother's gentle voice, her brother's laughter, and the familiar streets of her village. She missed the warmth of community and the feeling of belonging. But she also began to understand that life in the mountains was teaching her lessons she could not have learned anywhere else. She was learning patience, resilience, and self-reliance. She was learning that fear could be faced step by step, and that trust, even when difficult, could be built over time. Harun, too, was changing in subtle ways. Amina noticed that he allowed her small freedoms, letting her explore the surrounding forest, teaching her how to prepare food in new ways, and sharing stories of the mountains and the creatures that lived there. He revealed little of his own past, but in the careful way he guided her, she could sense the pain and loss that had shaped him. Each day, their lives intertwined more, not as master and servant, but as two people learning to coexist in a harsh but beautiful environment. By the end of the first month, Amina had begun to feel a tentative sense of belonging. She still missed her family and her old life, but she also realized that the mountains, the cabin, and Harun offered safety and a chance to grow stronger. She began to see that her fear, while natural, did not have to control her. Each day she faced challenges, the cold, the loneliness, the steep paths, but she met them with courage, learning to adapt and to appreciate the small victories. In those quiet mountain days, Amina discovered a new rhythm to life. She rose with the sun, worked alongside Harun, and rested under the stars at night. She found strength in her solitude and learned to trust in her own abilities. The cabin, once frightening and foreign, became a place where she could breathe, think, and begin to heal. The mountains, once intimidating, became a classroom of lessons about endurance, patience, and the unexpected kindness of people who seemed harsh at first glance. Amina knew that her journey was only beginning. There were still challenges ahead, and the past, the betrayal, the fear, and the uncertainty, was never far from her mind. But she also knew that she had survived the hardest days, and that in itself was proof of her strength. She had begun to understand that even in the most difficult circumstances, life could offer moments of hope, trust, and quiet connection. And in that understanding, she found the courage to face whatever the mountains and life might bring next. Life in the mountains had become a strange mixture of comfort and uncertainty for Amina. Though she had begun to adjust to the harsh landscape and the quiet companionship of Harun, her heart still carried the heavy burden of what her father had done. Each day, she woke with the memory of her father's cold eyes and the shock of his decision. Even as she chopped wood, tended the small garden, or helped Harun prepare meals, the thought of her old life lingered, a shadow she could not shake. The mountains, beautiful and serene as they were, could not erase the fear and anger that had been planted in her heart by the betrayal she had suffered. Amina often walked along the narrow paths near the cabin, trying to understand her feelings. The forest around her seemed alive, full of whispers carried by the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional call of a bird. Sometimes she imagined the trees and streams speaking to her, reminding her that life continued, even when it felt unfair or frightening. She began to write in a small notebook she had brought with her, pouring her thoughts onto the pages. She wrote about her mother, her brother, and the friends she had left behind. She wrote about the fear she felt toward her father, and the cautious trust she was beginning to feel toward Harun. Writing became a refuge, a way to make sense of her emotions in a world that seemed unpredictable and often harsh. Despite her efforts to find peace, Amina could not ignore the tension she felt with Harun. He was a man shaped by solitude, by survival, and by experiences that had left him cautious and reserved. He rarely spoke of his past, and his silence sometimes felt heavier than the mountains themselves. Amina wanted to ask him about his life, about the experiences that had made him so distant, but she feared intruding or being met with coldness. Still, her curiosity grew stronger each day. She wanted to understand him, not just as the man who had taken her in, but as a human being shaped by hardship and loss. One rainy afternoon, as the wind howled through the trees and the rain tapped against the roof of the cabin, Amina finally found the courage to ask. She had been helping Harun repair a small leak in the roof, and for a moment, their hands brushed as they worked. She looked at him, heart pounding, and said softly, "Harun, can you tell me about your past? About why you live alone in the mountains?" Harun paused, his hands stilling on the wooden beams. He did not speak immediately. The silence stretched between them, heavy and full of unspoken words. Finally, he looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry a lifetime of pain. "I've lost people I cared for," he said slowly, carefully choosing each word. "It is better to be alone than to risk losing them again." Amina listened, sensing the depth of his sorrow. She realized that his distance, his coldness at first, was not cruelty, it was a shield. He had built walls around himself to protect against pain, just as she had built walls around her own heart to protect against fear. For the first time, she felt a connection, a fragile understanding of the man who had seemed so frightening in the beginning. She did not speak, for fear that her words might break the fragile trust that had begun to form. Instead, she nodded, allowing silence to bridge the gap between them. The days that followed were filled with small discoveries. Harun began to share little stories about the mountains, how he had learned to track animals, find edible plants, and survive harsh winters. He taught Amina how to recognize the sounds of birds, the footprints of deer, and the signs of approaching storms. These lessons were practical, but they also revealed glimpses of his character, patient, observant, and deeply knowledgeable about the natural world. Amina began to see him as a teacher, a guide, and gradually as a companion. Yet even as trust grew, Amina's mind often wandered to thoughts of her father. She wondered if he ever regretted his actions, if he thought of her while she was living in the mountains. The anger she had carried for him did not disappear, but it began to mingle with a complicated understanding. She realized that her father's choices, as cruel as they seemed, were influenced by fear and the rigid traditions of their village. This did not excuse the pain he had caused, but it helped Amina see that people's actions are often more complicated than they appear on the surface. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the cabin, Amina overheard Harun speaking softly to himself. Curious, she approached quietly, only to realize that he was mourning someone long gone, a family member or a close friend. She could not tell. The sorrow in his voice was raw and unguarded, a glimpse into the depths of a man who had lived with loss and loneliness for many years. Amina felt a pang of empathy and understood that his toughness was born of necessity, not cruelty. She realized that both of them were survivors, shaped by the hardships of life in different ways, and that their experiences could perhaps bring them closer rather than drive them apart. Over time, Amina began to embrace the rhythms of the mountain life. She learned to wake before sunrise, tend the small garden, fetch water from the stream, and help with cooking and maintenance. Each task, though simple, became a source of confidence. She discovered that she could endure more than she had ever imagined, that fear could be faced and transformed into strength. The mountains, once intimidating and alien, became a classroom of resilience, teaching her lessons that the village could never have offered. Even as she adapted, Amina's emotional struggle continued. She missed human companionship beyond the quiet presence of Harun. She longed for laughter, for conversation, for the small comforts of community. She missed her mother's gentle guidance, her brother's playful teasing, and the familiar faces of her village. Some nights, she wept quietly by the fire, allowing herself to grieve the life she had lost. Other nights, she stared out at the moonlit peaks, finding solace in the vastness of the mountains and the knowledge that she was still alive, still capable of hope. One evening, a storm rolled over the peaks, fierce and unrelenting. Rain lashed against the cabin, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them almost to the ground. Amina huddled near the fire, feeling small and vulnerable. Harun worked tirelessly to secure the cabin, placing logs and stones to protect against the flooding and wind. Seeing him in action, determined and skilled, Amina felt a surge of admiration and gratitude. She realized that despite the fear she had felt when first arriving, she was not helpless. Harun's presence, his guidance, and his quiet strength had taught her how to endure, how to survive, and how to find courage in the face of uncertainty. After the storm passed, the mountains were washed clean, glistening under the rising sun. Amina stepped outside, inhaling the fresh, crisp air. The streams sparkled and the forest seemed renewed, as if the storm had brought a fresh start. She felt a small but powerful shift within herself. She was learning to live in the mountains, to face the challenges with determination, and to find moments of beauty even in the harshest conditions. She was learning not just to survive, but to grow. Yet the past remained close. Amina's thoughts often returned to her father and the village she had left behind. She wondered if reconciliation was possible, if understanding could ever replace the fear and anger she had felt. These thoughts were painful, but they also pushed her to reflect on human complexity, on the reasons people act as they do, on the weight of fear and tradition, and on the possibility of forgiveness. She realized that life was rarely simple, that people's actions were rarely black and white, and that true strength lay in understanding, patience, and resilience. Through these months, Amina's relationship with Harun deepened in quiet, subtle ways. They worked side by side, shared meals, and navigated the challenges of mountain life together. Words were few, but the bond grew through actions, gestures, and mutual understanding. She began to see him not as a stranger, but as a person shaped by hardship, capable of kindness and deserving of trust. Harun, in turn, began to show signs of respect and care for Amina, recognizing her strength, resilience, and intelligence. The connection between them was not dramatic or sudden, but gradual, built on shared experiences, mutual reliance, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's humanity. By the end of her third month in the mountains, Amina had begun to transform. The girl who had arrived terrified and uncertain was now learning to stand tall, face challenges, and embrace her new life with courage. The mountains, once a place of fear, had become a space of growth and discovery. Harun, once an intimidating figure, had become a mentor, a companion, and, in small ways, a friend. And though the past still lingered, and the pain of betrayal was never entirely gone, Amina had begun to understand that even in the harshest circumstances, life could offer moments of connection, hope, and unexpected kindness. Months had passed since Amina had first arrived in the mountains. She had grown stronger, more confident, and more aware of the harsh beauty of the life she now lived. The initial fear and despair that had dominated her days were slowly replaced with cautious trust, resilience, and a growing understanding of the mountain man, Harun. She had learned to navigate the winding paths, to gather food, to manage the cabin, and even to appreciate the quiet rhythm of a life shaped by nature. Yet despite these changes, a shadow lingered in her heart, a shadow cast by the memory of her father and the cruel decision that had sent her to the mountains. Amina's thoughts often returned to her village. She wondered what her father was doing, whether he regretted his actions, and if he even thought about her at all. She had lived with fear, confusion, and anger for so long that the idea of understanding his motives felt almost impossible. She remembered the day he had sent her away, the cold determination in his eyes, and the disbelief that had frozen her heart. For months, she had carried those memories silently, allowing them to sting but never letting them consume her. Yet deep down, she longed for answers, for some explanation that might ease the ache she felt. One morning, a messenger arrived at the cabin, a traveler passing through the mountains who had heard of Amina's situation. The man brought a letter from her father. Amina's hands trembled as she took the paper. The ink was slightly smudged from the journey, but the words were clear. She sat by the fire, carefully unfolding the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father's handwriting was familiar, yet the tone was different from the harshness she remembered. It was almost hesitant, as if he had struggled to put his thoughts into words. The letter began with an apology, though it was not the kind of apology one might expect. Karim admitted that he had made a decision that seemed cruel, but he explained that his actions were driven by fear rather than malice. He confessed that he had been worried about the gossip and judgment of the villagers, about how they might perceive Amina and the family's honor. In his mind, sending her to the mountains had been a way to protect her from shame, even if it caused her immediate pain. Amina read the words over and over, trying to reconcile them with the anger she had felt for so long. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the complexity of her father's motives. He had acted out of fear, pride, and a desire to protect, but his actions had been harsh and misguided. The revelation shocked her, not because it excused what he had done, but because it showed that the story was far more complicated than she had imagined. Her father was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake, one that had hurt the person he loved most. Amina's mind was flooded with conflicting emotions. She felt relief, knowing that her father's intention had not been to harm her out of hatred. She felt sadness, realizing that he had allowed fear to dictate his actions. And she felt a cautious hope, wondering if forgiveness was possible, and if understanding his perspective might finally bring some peace to her heart. The mountains, once a place of isolation and challenge, now seemed to offer a new perspective on her life and the choices of those around her. Harun noticed the change in Amina almost immediately. She spent hours by the fire, reading and rereading the letter, her expression a mixture of shock, relief, and thoughtfulness. He approached her quietly, understanding that this moment was significant. "What does it say?" he asked softly, his voice steady but gentle. Amina handed him the letter and he read it carefully, his brow furrowed as he absorbed the words. "It seems complicated," he said finally. "He didn't mean to hurt you. He acted out of fear, not cruelty." Amina nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. "I know," she whispered, "but it still hurt. I still felt abandoned and betrayed. I didn't understand why he would do something so extreme." Harun placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet support. "People make mistakes. Sometimes their actions seem cruel, even when their hearts are not. You cannot change what happened, but you can choose how you live from this point forward." His words resonated deeply with Amina. She realized that the mountains had taught her resilience, patience, and strength, not just through physical challenges, but through the emotional journey she had endured. She had faced fear, loneliness, and betrayal, and she had survived. She had learned to navigate the complexities of human behavior, to recognize that people's actions are rarely simple, and to find compassion even in situations that seemed unforgivable. Over the next days, Amina reflected on her father's letter and her own feelings. She thought about her life in the village, the family she had left behind, and the harsh decisions that had shaped her journey. She realized that forgiveness was not about excusing what had happened, but about freeing herself from the constant pain and anger that had weighed her down. She could acknowledge the hurt, understand the motives, and still move forward with strength and dignity. As Amina processed these emotions, her relationship with Harun grew deeper. The bond between them was no longer just about survival or shared labor. It was about trust, understanding, and mutual respect. Harun shared more of his past, recounting stories of loss, survival, and lessons learned in the mountains. Amina listened intently, realizing that everyone carries their own burdens and that life's challenges shape people in ways that are not always visible. She saw Harun not just as a guide or protector, but as a man who had endured pain and hardship, and who had chosen to channel his experiences into quiet strength and resilience. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching the sun set behind the mountains, Amina spoke of her father and the letter. "I never imagined he could feel fear so strongly that it made him act this way," she said softly. "I thought he only cared about control and honor, but now I see there was more to it. It doesn't take away the hurt, but it helps me understand." Harun nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Understanding is the first step toward peace. You can acknowledge the pain and still find a way to live with it. Life is rarely fair, but we have the power to choose how we respond. Amina felt a sense of relief wash over her. The mountains, which had once seemed so isolating and unforgiving, now felt like a place of learning and growth. She had faced fear, betrayal, and uncertainty, and she had emerged stronger, more aware, and more capable of compassion. The revelation about her father's intentions did not erase the past, but it added depth to her understanding and allowed her to see the world, and the people in it, in a more nuanced way. In the weeks that followed, Amina found herself thinking less about anger and more about possibility. She began to focus on her own growth, the skills she had learned, and the relationships she had built in the mountains. She realized that while she could not change the past, she could shape her future. She could embrace the strength she had discovered, nurture the trust she had developed with Harun, and move forward with a sense of purpose and courage. One morning, as Amina gathered water from the stream, she felt a sense of clarity she had not experienced before. The mountains, the cabin, and the challenges she had faced had all taught her something invaluable. Life is unpredictable, people's actions are complex, and forgiveness, though difficult, is a choice that can bring freedom and peace. She understood now that her father's actions, while painful, were shaped by fear and concern, and that recognizing this truth allowed her to release some of the burden she had carried for so long. Amina returned to the cabin with a lighter heart, ready to face the days ahead with renewed strength. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she also knew that she had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The mountains had tested her, the betrayal had challenged her, and the quiet companionship of Harun had guided her through the darkest moments. Now, with understanding and clarity, she was ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead, to live with courage, and to continue building a life shaped not by fear or anger, but by strength, hope, and compassion. Amina had spent months in the mountains learning, struggling, and growing. The once terrifying wilderness had become familiar and even comforting in its quiet rhythms. Each day was still a challenge, but the challenges no longer seemed insurmountable. She had learned to navigate the steep trails, to gather food and water, and to manage the small cabin alongside Harun. But the most profound changes were not in her physical skills, they were in her heart, mind, and spirit. She had grown stronger, more confident, and more capable of understanding the world and the people around her. The revelation about her father's motives had shifted something deep inside her. While the initial pain of his decision had left scars, understanding that he acted out of fear rather than malice helped Amina release some of the anger that had weighed heavily on her. She began to forgive, not to excuse the betrayal, but to free herself from carrying the burden of resentment. She realized that holding onto anger only made life heavier and darker, and that letting go could open space for growth, peace, and even hope. Life in the cabin had become routine yet fulfilling. Amina woke early each day, her movements in sync with the rising sun. She tended the small garden, harvested fresh herbs, and helped Harun with daily chores. She had grown skilled at identifying plants and animals in the forest, and she could navigate paths that had once terrified her. Each task, once daunting, now brought a sense of accomplishment. The mountains no longer felt like a trap. They were a teacher, offering lessons in patience, resilience, and the quiet joys of life. Harun and Amina's relationship continued to deepen in subtle but meaningful ways. Trust had blossomed into a quiet companionship. They spoke less than before, but when they did, their words carried sincerity and understanding. Harun began to share stories of his life, tales of survival, lessons learned from solitude, and memories of people he had loved and lost. Amina listened carefully, recognizing that every story revealed a piece of the man he was. She began to understand his choices, his silence, and his initial coldness, and she found empathy growing in her heart. One crisp morning, as they walked together through the forest, Harun stopped and gestured toward a clearing. "Look," he said quietly, "this is where I first learned to survive alone. Every mistake I made here taught me something important." Amina looked around the clearing, noticing the careful arrangements of stones, the signs of small fires long gone, and the faint trails where animals had passed. She realized that survival was more than just physical. It required patience, observation, and the courage to face one's fears. She understood then that she had grown in the same way, learning not just to endure, but to thrive. Though Amina had grown stronger, she still felt a longing for human connection beyond Harun. She missed her mother, her brother, and the familiar faces of the village. Yet she also understood that life had taken a different path, one that required her to adapt and find joy in unexpected places. She began to write letters to her family, though she hesitated to send them at first. The act of writing allowed her to process her emotions, to express love and longing, and to reflect on her journey. It was a way of reconnecting with the life she had left behind while honoring the life she was building in the mountains. One evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amina and Harun sat by the fire, sharing a quiet meal. The warmth of the fire, the scent of herbs and roasted vegetables, and the soft sounds of the mountains created a sense of peace. For the first time in months, Amina felt a deep sense of contentment. She realized that she had not only survived the challenges of the mountains, but she had also discovered a new sense of self, one that was resilient, thoughtful, and compassionate. The months of hardship and learning had also taught her the importance of hope. Amina had faced fear, betrayal, and uncertainty, yet she had emerged stronger and wiser. She understood that life was unpredictable, that people made mistakes, and that even in the most difficult circumstances, moments of kindness and understanding could exist. She felt a quiet determination to embrace these lessons and to use them to shape her future, no matter where it might lead. One morning, a letter finally arrived from her village. It was from her mother, full of love, concern, and news about her brother. Amina read it slowly, feeling a mixture of joy, longing, and reassurance. She realized that her family still cared for her, that their love had not diminished despite the distance and the pain of the past. The letter was a reminder that connections could endure, even when circumstances forced separation. It also reinforced the idea that forgiveness and understanding could heal wounds over time. Amina shared the letter with Harun, who read it carefully, nodding. "Family can be complicated," he said softly, "but love can endure even the hardest tests. You are fortunate to have that connection, even if it is far away." These reflections gave Amina a new perspective. She began to think about how she could help others, using the lessons she had learned to guide and support those facing challenges of their own. She understood the pain of fear, betrayal, and isolation, and she wanted to offer hope and encouragement to those in similar situations. The mountains, once a place of survival, had become a place of learning and growth, not just for her, but potentially for others as well. Amina also began to consider her relationship with Harun in a new light. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated her early days were gone, replaced by respect, trust, and a quiet companionship. She recognized that the bond they shared was rare, a connection built on understanding, shared experiences, and the ability to see each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. It was not a conventional relationship, but it was real, meaningful, and nurturing. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the cabin together, Harun paused and looked at her. "You have grown strong," he said simply. "I am proud of how you have faced these challenges. You have endured much and learned more than I could have imagined." Amina felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. They were not grand or dramatic, but they carried sincerity and recognition, the acknowledgement of her courage and growth. She realized that she had not only survived the mountains, but she had also discovered her own strength, resilience, and ability to face the unknown with determination. The seasons changed, and with them, Amina's life in the mountains became more established. She embraced the rhythm of the land, finding joy in small tasks, beauty in the natural world, and peace in her own growth. She had transformed from a frightened girl into a confident young woman, capable of navigating both the physical challenges of the mountains and the emotional complexities of life. Though the past was never far from her thoughts, Amina had learned to integrate it into her life in a healthy way. She forgave her father, understanding his fear and intentions, and she found ways to stay connected to her family despite the distance. She recognized that life was full of challenges, but also full of lessons, connections, and opportunities for growth. By the time the first snow of winter fell, Amina felt a profound sense of accomplishment and peace. She had built a life in the mountains, developed a meaningful bond with Harun, and discovered her own resilience and strength. She had faced fear, betrayal, and uncertainty, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of understanding both herself and others. One quiet evening, as the snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled in the cabin, Amina reflected on her journey. She realized that the mountains, once a place of fear and isolation, had become a source of strength, learning, and unexpected joy. She had learned to face challenges with courage, to trust others cautiously, and to embrace both the beauty and hardship of life. She understood that forgiveness and understanding could heal wounds, that resilience could be cultivated through experience, and that even in the most difficult circumstances, hope could flourish. Amina had come a long way from the frightened girl her father had sent to the mountains. She had endured the hardships, learned from the challenges, and grown into a young woman capable of facing life with confidence, compassion, and hope. The mountains had tested her, but they had also taught her invaluable lessons, lessons she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And so, in the quiet of the snowy evening, with the fire warm and Harun nearby, Amina looked out at the peaks and valleys that had once seemed so intimidating. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the strength she had discovered within herself. She knew that life would continue to present challenges, but she also knew that she had the courage, wisdom, and resilience to meet them head-on. The mountains, once a place of fear, had become a place of growth, hope, and new beginnings, and Amina was ready to embrace the future with a heart full of strength and possibility.